I found out later from Lauren that John, who I'd known for years,
John Belushi,
even before
right.
SNL, had been quite kind of jealous about my rise to fame.
You invented that. Mm-hmm. So it might seem that...
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Chevy Chase walked into SNL for what would be his last time. By the end of that night, he was banned forever. It started with him hitting a female cast member. Then came the sexual comments. But that wasn't even his worst moment. Cast members started quitting when he showed up. Directors refused to work with him. One walked away from directing Christmas Vacation just to avoid him. In 2018, a kid beat him up on the highway and didn't even know who he was. The man who made everyone laugh became the man nobody wanted around. Chevy Chase was born Cornelius Crane Chase on October 8, 1943. From the moment he arrived, his life was wrapped up in power and wealth. His adoptive grandfather was Cornelius Vanderbilt Crane, which gave him a direct connection to the famous Vanderbilt dynasty. That family had built a fortune on railroads and shipping during the 1800s, becoming one of America's most famous and powerful clans. This meant Chase grew up with an elite lifestyle, surrounded by money, influence, and social prestige. Yet, for all the glitter, his personal life would soon show a very different reality. Even as he smiled on stage later in life, his childhood struggles and inner pain painted a much darker story. His nickname, Chevy, came from something much older than American railroads. His grandmother chose it because of the Ballad of Chevy Chase, a 15th-century story about a fierce fight between English and Scottish forces. The Douglas clan fought in that legendary border skirmish, and they happened to be Chase's ancestors. The ballad was famous enough to inspire a suburb outside Washington, D.C., called Chevy Chase. By calling him Chevy, his grandmother was keeping him tied to centuries of courage and endurance. The name was more than a catchy nickname. It was part of his family's deep history and their proud Scottish past. But behind the walls of that wealthy world, things weren't as perfect as they looked. When Chase was just 4 years old, his parents divorced, breaking up what should have been a safe home. Even worse, his mother and stepfather were abusive. They would lock him in closets for hours and hit him. The punishments left deep scars. Fans who only saw him as a funny star were shocked to learn this much later. When Chase talked openly about the trauma in interviews and his memoirs, that pain followed him into adulthood and shaped his relationships. It was proof that even privilege can hide terrible suffering. School was also a mix of brilliance and chaos. Chase went to some of the top schools, like Riverdale Country School in New York, but he was often expelled for acting out. Later, at the Stockbridge School, he became valedictorian, but still had a rebellious streak. At Haverford College, he pulled a prank so wild it became part of college legend. He was kicked out for keeping a cow in his dorm room. Every success was mixed with a bit of trouble. That playful, rebellious energy was already becoming part of his comedy style, showing up years later on television. Before comedy took over his life, music was his first passion. At Bard College, Chase played drums and keyboards in a jazz group called Leather Canary. Two of his bandmates, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, would later form Steely Dan. Even back then, Chase was talented and creative. Leather Canary had energy and style, and playing alongside future rock legends gave him an eye for timing and rhythm. That sense of rhythm would one day help him stand out as one of America's top comedians. By 1967, Chase was part of a bold new comedy group called Channel One in New York. They weren't doing traditional skits. Instead, they showed short, satirical videos on multiple TVs at their tiny theater on East 60th Street. Channel One's humor was sharp, rebellious, and often risque. It broke new ground at a time when most comedy was still tame. The most popular Channel One sketches were compiled into a movie in 1974 called The Groove Tube, directed by co-founder Ken Shapiro. Made for only $200,000, the film grossed over $9 million. One fake news desk segment was a direct inspiration for Chase's famous Weekend Update on SNL. A few years before SNL, Chase joined the National Lampoon Radio Hour in 1973. The radio show aired every week, and introduced some of the most talented comedy names of the era, like John Belushi, Gilda Radner, Bill Murray, Christopher Guest, and Harold Ramis. The team wrote and performed sharp, fast comedy that shaped American humor for years. Even though the show was cut back after only 13 episodes due to its tough pace, nearly all its players were hired for SNL, and Chase was front and center. That same year, he co-wrote and performed in National Lampoon's off-Broadway hit Lemmings. The show was a parody of the Woodstock Festival, reimagined as Woodchuck, 3 Days of Peace, Love, and Death. Chase played drums and sang, and the whole cast, including John Belushi and Christopher Guest, sent up rock legends like Bob Dylan and John Denver. Critics loved it. Time magazine called the show an uproarious spoof of the rock scene, and its catchy songs were eventually released as an album. Before most people even knew his face, Chase was writing satire for Mad magazine. In 1970, he wrote a one-page spoof of Mission Impossible, and John Cullen Murphy did the art. That issue sold millions of copies. Being part of Mad was a big deal. The magazine was at its peak and had writers like Charles Schultz and Andy Griffith. Getting your work published there, and even earning an invite on Mad's famous trip for top contributors, was a badge of honor. It was a rainy night in Los Angeles in the spring of 1975. Chevy Chase, who was mostly unknown at the time, was standing in line at the Paramount Theater for the premiere of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. The Los Angeles Film Festival was buzzing around him. Chase decided to do what he did best: make people laugh. He cracked jokes and did impressions for the crowd. Nearby was Lorne Michaels, a Canadian producer looking for talent for a new late-night comedy show. Suddenly, Chase slipped and fell into a pothole, landing in a big puddle. Even as water dripped from him, he kept joking. NBC executive Dick Ebersol saw this and heard Michaels say, "How could you say no to someone crazy enough to do that?" Michaels invited Chase to the Chateau Marmont for a meeting. That rain-soaked moment helped him land a spot as a writer and performer on a new show that would soon become Saturday Night Live. When SNL premiered on October 11, 1975, Chase was picked to anchor the fake news segment. It was a new idea, and Chase gave it his own style. Every week on Weekend Update, he told the news with a serious face, but hilarious words. The catchphrase, "I'm Chevy Chase, and you're not," became famous overnight. Even decades later, people still wear it on shirts. Chase took real news and made it absurd, poking fun at serious topics with jokes like, "Generalissimo Francisco Franco is still dead." Every time he ended the segment with, "Good night and have a pleasant tomorrow," audiences felt they were in on the joke. That season, Chase also became famous for his impression of President Gerald Ford. On June 1st, 1975, Ford had slipped while stepping off Air Force One in Salzburg, Austria. Chase used that moment for laughs. On SNL's fourth episode, November 8, 1975, Chase began playing Ford as a clumsy president who tripped over everything. Every time Ford appeared on stage, Chase would knock into furniture, bang his head, and jump up, saying, "No problem, no problem." Chase never mimicked Ford's voice. Instead, he played him like someone always falling down. Ford himself even laughed at the sketches, though they shaped the public image of him as a bumbling president forever. Chase's talent was clear to everyone. In 1976, after just one season, he won 2 Primetime Emmys, one for writing and one for his performance. He also picked up a Golden Globe for writing. New York Magazine called him the funniest man in America in 1975. Even NBC hinted that he might one day take over Johnny Carson's seat as guest host of The Tonight Show. Rolling Stone later wrote that Chase was one of the top 10 most important SNL cast members, noting that in just one season, he defined the show's style and humor. But after all this success, Chase decided to leave SNL. His last episode was October 30th, 1976. He was the first cast member to ever leave. Many wondered why someone would give up so much so soon. Chase joked that the reason was money. Lots of money, but the truth was more personal. He was deeply in love with actress Jacqueline Carlin. Chase said, "I left for a girl that I was in love with, a girl who would not leave California." Chevy Chase became a movie star almost overnight. In 1978, he appeared in Foul Play, a comedy thriller with Goldie Hawn. It was his very first leading role. Only 2 years earlier, Chase was on Saturday Night Live. But this one film changed everything. Foul Play was a huge hit. It earned more than $44 million at the box office, which was a big number back then. The movie also earned 7 Golden Globe nominations. Chase himself was up for Best Actor. It was a fast and surprising rise. The film mixed comedy with suspense and followed a wild plot to assassinate the Pope. Critics were divided, but everyone agreed on one thing: Chase was a natural star. He had great comic timing and charm. Interestingly, Chase had been offered a role in Animal House, but he turned it down to do Foul Play, a choice that shaped his career forever. The film was so popular that it even led to a short-lived TV series in 1981. Foul Play made him a household name, and it was the perfect launch into a decade of comedy hits. But behind the scenes, people were starting to see a more difficult side of Chevy Chase. In 1980, Chase appeared in Caddyshack as the cool and carefree golfer Ty Webb. The movie almost didn't happen with him at all. The studio wanted a big star to anchor the film, so Chase was their top choice. They spent $6 million to make it, and it earned nearly $40 million in the U.S. alone. The film was chaotic and rebellious, just like its characters. Chase's smooth style and sharp one-liners were perfect. Even though the reviews were mixed at first, Caddyshack became one of the most famous comedies ever. Chase's scenes with Bill Murray were improvised and hilarious. The film also marked the directorial debut of Harold Ramis and helped inspire a new style of comedy. Chase was the only one of the main actors who returned for Caddyshack 2 in 1988. Even today, people still quote the film, and Ty Webb is considered one of comedy's most memorable characters. By 1983, Chase had created one of his most famous roles as Clark Griswold in National Lampoon's Vacation. The film, based on a John Hughes story, earned over $61 million. Chase played a dad who just wanted to give his family a great trip. The joke was that everything went wrong. Audiences loved Clark's clumsy, well-meaning style. The character was so popular that 4 more films followed, including Christmas Vacation, which earned $71 million in 1989. Altogether, the franchise grossed more than $322 million. Even after 40 years, people still laugh at Clark Griswold and his disasters. The movies have become part of American pop culture, and Chase proved he could make one character funny again and again. By the late 1980s, Chase was earning $7 million for every film, about $15 million in today's money. That put him alongside Hollywood's top action and drama stars. His work in movies like Fletch and Christmas Vacation had earned him serious power. Studios knew his name could sell tickets, so they gave him creative control too. But this was also when his reputation for being difficult began to grow. Chase was demanding on set and often argued about billing and scripts. Stories about his big ego followed him as much as his jokes. It was a strange contrast. He was making audiences laugh, but behind the scenes, people weren't always laughing with him. Chase showed another side of his talent in Fletch, playing a clever undercover reporter who always had a quick joke. Released in 1985, Fletch was made for $8 million and brought in $60 million worldwide. Chase improvised many of the character's funniest moments, even making up fake names as he went along. Audiences loved the mix of comedy and mystery, and critics praised Chase's sharp comic timing. The role became one of his most famous, and he returned for Fletch Lives in 1989. Hollywood even tried to reboot Fletch years later, but the character was so tied to Chase that it never quite worked. Even decades after its release, people still see Fletch as one of the smartest, funniest comedy thrillers ever. But success had its dark side. Back at Saturday Night Live, Chase's rapid rise had created bad blood with John Belushi. Belushi, already a star, thought Chase was hogging the spotlight. He told everyone that Chase was arrogant and hard to work with. Belushi even mocked Chase on live television, making their feud very public. On one famous night in July 1976, Belushi and Chase staged a fight during a cold open. What looked like a joke was actually their real tension spilling out on camera. It was a toxic atmosphere that eventually led Chase to leave SNL after one season. When Chase returned as a guest host, In February 1978, that tension was still there. Bill Murray, who had taken Chase's spot in the cast, was especially angry. Murray thought Chase was too full of himself and had left SNL too soon. The two argued backstage and began exchanging personal insults. Murray told Chase to go sleep with his wife. Chase hit back, mocking Murray's face. The fight got so heated that punches were thrown in John Belushi's dressing room. Other cast members and even guest Billy Joel watched as it happened. Brian Doyle Murray and Belushi had to jump in to separate them. Minutes later, Chase had to go on stage as if nothing happened. The whole cast was shaken. They described it like a family fight that left everyone feeling tense and sad. Then, in 1985, Terry Sweeney was the first openly gay cast member, and Chase treated him terribly. This was during the AIDS crisis, when fear and misinformation were everywhere. Chase thought it would be funny to do a sketch where Sweeney played a character with AIDS, weighed every week to see if he had lost weight. It was an incredibly cruel idea. Chase would also greet Sweeney with, "Oh, you're the gay guy, right?" and then add vulgar remarks like, "You can start by licking my balls." It wasn't just a one-time joke. It kept happening. The work environment was so toxic. Sweeney only lasted one season, and SNL didn't hire another openly gay male cast member for more than 2 years. When Chase was finally told to apologize, he wasn't sorry at all. Sweeney later recalled that Chase was furious at being held responsible, not the least bit remorseful. That wasn't the end of it. On February 15, 1997, Chase returned to SNL as a guest host, and it was a disaster. Right away during rehearsals, he smacked cast member Cherry O'Terry on the back of the head. Lorne Michaels, the show's creator, decided then and there to ban him for good. It wasn't just the physical aggression. Chase also harassed women who were part of the show, making crude jokes and sexually charged comments. Will Ferrell, who witnessed it, called the whole thing abusive. Chase targeted women in particular, going so far as to say to one female writer, "Maybe you can give me a hand job later." Ferrell would later say that everyone wished they had gotten up and walked out, but in that moment they were just too shocked. The whole atmosphere was tense and degrading, and Chase showed no respect for the people working around him. Chris Columbus was once set to direct National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation back in 1989. At that time, he was an up-and-coming talent, hoping to make his mark. But everything changed after his first meeting with Chevy Chase. Columbus would later say it was the most bizarre and surreal meeting of his career. He prepared to talk about his vision for the film, but Chase sat silently for nearly 40 minutes and wouldn't even acknowledge him. Then, out of nowhere, Chase broke silence with a strange question. "Wait a second. You're the director?" Columbus nodded, and Chase replied, "Oh, I thought you were a drummer." That was it. The meeting was over. Chase simply stood up and said, "I got to go," leaving Columbus stunned and insulted. They tried one more dinner together, this time with writer John Hughes, but it went just as badly. Columbus told Hughes, "This is really hard for me, but I can't do this movie with Chevy Chase." It wasn't just an awkward personality clash. Columbus had seen something toxic in Chase that he didn't want to work with. At the time, walking away was a risky move. Columbus badly needed a hit after his last film, Heartbreak Hotel, had bombed, but Hughes respected his decision and handed him 2 new scripts. One was called Reach the Rock, which didn't interest him. The other was Home Alone. Columbus felt an instant connection. Home Alone went on to earn over $476 million worldwide, making him one of Hollywood's most successful directors overnight. It led to Mrs. Doubtfire and the first 2 Harry Potter films, career highs that might never have happened if he'd stayed on Christmas Vacation. Meanwhile, Chase's reputation kept sinking. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, stories spread about how difficult he was to work with. Directors and producers began to avoid him. Columbus would say he was just one of many who couldn't work with him. Chase often treated colleagues badly, refused to collaborate, and even fought co-stars like Bill Murray on the set of Saturday Night Live. By then, Chase was so notorious that many directors simply refused to work with him at all. His career began to tumble. Movies like Nothing But Trouble, 1991, Memoirs of an Invisible Man, 1992, and Cops and Robertsons, 1994, all flopped, grossing only $34 million combined, a terrible number for someone who had once been a top comedy star. Even Chase admitted Nothing But Trouble was the worst movie he'd ever make. Then came the big disaster. The Chevy Chase Show in 1993. Fox had spent millions transforming a theater into the Chevy Chase Theater, betting that he could pull in 5 to 6 million nightly viewers. But it was a ratings nightmare. Fewer than 3 million people tuned in at first, and by the end of its short run, fewer than 2 million watched. Time called Chase nervous and totally at sea, and Entertainment Weekly gave the show an F, pointing out that Chase failed to connect with guests or the audience. Guests didn't want to appear. Viewers switched off, and Fox pulled the plug after just 5 weeks. Within 48 hours, the big sign was painted over. Even Chase later called the show very constraining and admitted he'd never do it again. Chevy Chase never seemed to hold back. On the set of Community, things went way past jokes and into a really ugly place. Donald Glover was one of the most talented people there. Chase knew that, but instead of admiring him, Chase kept throwing harsh remarks. They weren't just offhand remarks, they were nasty and often racist. One time he told Glover, "People think you're funnier because you're black." Another time, he'd wait between takes to make sure Glover heard him. Glover handled it calmly, but everyone could feel the weight of it. Dan Harmon, who created the show, saw it too. Harmon felt Chase's insults weren't random. They were driven by pure jealousy. Harmon told The New Yorker that Chase had realized just how special Glover was before anyone else. Instead of cheering him on, Chase tried to make him stumble. Harmon apologized to Glover more than once. Glover would just shrug it off, but Harmon understood what was going on. It was someone who had been a star for years, seeing a new star rise up and lashing out because he couldn't face the fact that his time was fading. And then came the N-word. Chase was in the middle of complaining about his character one day, and that word slipped out loud and clear. It happened right in front of everyone. Yvette Nicole Brown was so angry that she walked off. She told producers she wouldn't come back until Chase was gone. Within hours, he was off the lot. Writers rushed to kill off his character. It was over for him, just like that. The show had finally had enough. By the time the Season 3 wrap party rolled around, everyone had a lot to say. Harmon decided they'd say it together. During the party, with Chase's wife and daughter right there, Harmon led a loud chant, "Fuck you, Chevy!" Almost everyone joined in. It was a release, a kind of final goodbye to the toxic behavior they'd put up with for years. Chase heard every word. There was nowhere to hide. And then there was the voicemail. After all this, Chase left Harmon a long, furious message. He called him every name under the sun, insulted his work, and even hoped he'd die early because of his eating habits. Harmon played the message at his comedy show. That was a low blow too, making sure everyone heard just how deep the fight ran. By the time Chase was officially let go, everyone was exhausted. Producers decided to write him out entirely. Brown made it clear that they wouldn't shoot another scene with him. It wasn't just a firing. It was a very public removal. Years later, when the Community cast reunited online for a table read, they picked the one episode that focused on Pierce dying. Chase wasn't invited. Nobody even mentioned him. That didn't slow him down. Even at 74, Chase was still quick to argue. On February 9, 2018, he chased a pickup on Interstate 87 near the Governor Mario M. Cuomo Bridge. He thought they'd hit him. When they pulled over, tempers flared. A young guy named Michael Landrio cursed at him. Chase shot back. Landrio kicked him and left him on the ground. Later, Landrio told police that he didn't recognize Chase at all. He had to Google him. And Chase, even after all this, he stayed the same. In 2022, when CBS asked him about his reputation, he didn't bother to pretend. "I don't give a crap," he said. "I am who I am." That was that. Even as the world kept calling him difficult and even cruel, Chase never felt the need to change. It was as if none of the anger, the pain, or the damage ever touched him at all.